Picture this. The morning mist clings to ancient cobblestones like the breath of your ancestors, and through the iron bars of your prison cell, you watch Spanish soldiers hammering nails into wood that will soon hold the weight of your bloodline's final moments. 4 months have passed since they dragged you from the mountains in chains. 4 months since the dream you carried died in the snow at Checacupe. Your breath fogs the small window as you press your face against the cold metal, desperate to see everything while you still can. The plaza below spreads out like a theatre stage, and you are about to become its main performance. Workers in rough wool tunics, men who look like your own people, arrange wooden platforms under the watchful eyes of soldiers whose polished boots have never walked the high mountain paths where you were born. They call you Túpac Amaru now, though that name sits heavy on your shoulders like a cloak you never asked to wear. Your real name whispers itself in the stone walls around you, José Gabriel Condorcanqui, the man who tried to save his people by working within their system, the man who believed Spanish law might bend toward justice if pushed by the right hands. How foolish that seems. Now, the year is 1781, and you have been many things. A tax collector who spoke both Spanish and Quechua, trusted by colonial administrators to squeeze tribute from indigenous communities. A man who wore European clothes and studied Latin, who believed education might build bridges across the vast canyon between conqueror and conquered. A husband who loved a woman brave enough to fight beside you when fighting became the only choice left. You had started with petitions, not weapons. Formal requests filed in perfect Spanish, citing colonial law and appealing to royal mercy. You had believed God help you. You had actually believed that the Spanish Empire was capable of reform, that justice might flow through proper channels if you could just find the right words, the right argument, the right combination of reason and respect. The memory tastes bitter now. Years of travelling to distant courts, bowing before administrators who smiled with their mouths while their eyes calculated the profit margin of your people's suffering. Watching your carefully crafted appeals disappear into bureaucratic silence while the meter system continued to devour young men like a hungry god, sending them to die in silver mines that enriched Spanish nobles who had never seen the Andes. Outside your cell, footsteps echo in the corridor. Spanish voices discuss tomorrow's arrangements with the casual efficiency of men planning a market day. They speak of you in the third person, as if you have already ceased to exist. El Indio will be brought out first, one says. The word hits you like a physical blow. Indio, the reduction of everything you are to colonial convenience. You are not merely Indian, you carry the blood of sun kings who ruled these mountains when Europeans still huddled in medieval darkness. But blood means nothing to men who measure worth in gold. Through the window, you see him, Visitador José Antonio de Areche, the architect of your destruction. His silk coat catches the morning light, fabric that costs more than most of your people earn in a lifetime. He moves with the unhurried confidence of a man who has never questioned his right to rule over others, never wondered if the privileges he enjoys might be built on others' bones. Arechi had offered you mercy once, if you would renounce your claims and publicly submit to Spanish authority. The offer came with conditions that would have required you to betray everyone who had followed you into rebellion. You think of the faces weathered campesinos who had left their fields to take up ancient weapons, young men who had never known freedom but dreamed it might be possible, women who had fed your armies with their own children's food because they believed in something larger than survival. The sound of hammering grows louder. They are building something substantial out there, something designed to hold the weight of bodies and the attention of crowds. Colonial justice, you have learned, is always performed for an audience. The Spanish understand that power exists as much in perception as in reality, that the right kind of spectacular cruelty can silence resistance for generations. A key turns in your lock. The guard who enters avoids your eyes, his face carefully blank. He sets down a bowl of thin gruel and a cup of water without speaking. You recognize him, Pedro, a young mestizo from Cusco, whose mixed heritage places him in the uncertain space between Spanish and indigenous worlds. His uniform makes him Spanish property, but his dark eyes carry guilt that tells you he understands exactly what you represent. Tomorrow, he finally whispers in Quechua, the musical language of your ancestors that Spanish priests have spent centuries trying to erase. The single word carries the weight of inevitability, but also something else, a recognition that tomorrow will change everything, not just for you, but for everyone who watches. You nod, acknowledging both the information and the risk he took to share it in your native tongue. Speaking Quechua within these walls is itself an act of defiance, a small flame of resistance that even prison cannot extinguish. After he leaves, you sit on the stone floor and remember the moment everything began to crumble. Not the military defeat that came later, but the morning you realized that working within their system meant becoming complicit in your people's destruction. The day you stopped being José Gabriel, the colonial administrator, and became Túpac Amaru, the rebel. The morning mist is lifting now, revealing the full scope of tomorrow's stage. The plaza fills with early spectators, indigenous faces mixed with Spanish settlers, everyone drawn by the morbid fascination of public execution. They come to witness the end of something, though most do not yet understand what they are about to see destroyed. You close your eyes and feel the weight of ancestral memory. Somewhere in your blood flows the legacy of the first Túpac Amaru, your great-great-great-grandfather, garroted by Spanish authorities in this same plaza 2 centuries ago. His death was meant to end indigenous resistance forever. Instead, it planted seeds that grew into your rebellion. The sound of your cell door opening cuts through the pre-dawn darkness like a blade through silk. 3 guards stand silhouetted against the corridor's torchlight, their faces hidden in shadow but their purpose crystal clear. Your body moves before your mind fully awakens. Muscle memory from months of captivity, teaching you to submit quickly to avoid the bite of their clubs. Time to prepare you, Curacao, the sergeant says, using your traditional title with mockery that stings worse than any physical blow. They have stripped you of your Spanish clothes, the European dress that once marked your position within colonial hierarchy, and brought rough indigenous garments that transform you back into what they need you to be. A symbol of defeated native defiance. As they bind your hands with rope that smells of hemp and horses, you catch glimpses through the doorway of other prisoners being led from their cells. Your heart stops when you recognize the familiar shapes moving in the corridor's half-light. Michaela walks with her head high, her long black hair loose around her shoulders instead of braided in the careful style she preferred when commanding troops. Behind her, your sons Hipólito and Fernando move like sleepwalkers, their young faces marked by months of imprisonment and interrogation. The sight of your family transforms abstract fear into something sharp and immediate that cuts through your chest like winter wind. You had known this moment would come, had prepared yourself for your own death with the resignation of a man who chose his path despite its inevitable destination. But watching your wife and children being led to execution awakens a different kind of agony, the helpless rage of a father and husband who cannot protect the people he loves most. They march you through corridors lined with religious paintings, European saints with pale skin and blue eyes staring down at the procession of condemned indigenous bodies. The irony cuts deep, these Spanish Christs preaching love and mercy while their earthly representatives prepare to commit murder in God's name. You had once found comfort in Christianity, believing it might offer common ground between Spanish and indigenous peoples. Now you see it for what it has become in colonial hands, another tool of domination disguised as salvation. The plaza's roar reaches your ears before you see the crowd. Thousands of voices create a wall of sound that grows louder as you approach the heavy wooden doors that separate the building's quiet corridors from the public stage of imperial justice. Spanish officials have declared a holiday for your execution, closing markets and schools so everyone can witness the price of rebellion against colonial authority. The doors swing open, and morning light blinds you for a moment before your eyes adjust to reveal the full scope of what the Spanish have prepared. The plaza has been transformed into an amphitheatre of death, with raised platforms for colonial officials draped in crimson cloth, while indigenous spectators are forced to stand in the mud below, surrounded by soldiers with bayonets fixed to their rifles. But it is the scaffold itself that makes your breath catch in your throat, not a simple gallows that would be too quick, too merciful for the message Areche wants to send. Instead, a complex wooden structure rises from the plaza's center, like an altar built for human sacrifice. Ropes and chains hang from crossbeams, while 4 horses wait at the corners, their handlers checking leather straps with professional attention to detail. Visitador Areche stands at a lectern positioned so his voice will carry across the entire plaza, dressed in his finest court attire, as if this were a celebration rather than mass murder. He unfurls a scroll that catches the morning breeze, the parchment crackling with the dry sound of official documents that have sealed countless fates throughout colonial history. Citizens of Cusco, his voice booms across the crowd, each word carefully projected to reach even the furthest corners of the plaza. You are gathered to witness justice delivered upon those who would disturb the peace and prosperity of His Catholic Majesty's loyal subjects. The formal language cannot disguise what everyone present understands. This is theatre, not justice. The Spanish have turned your death into entertainment, your family's suffering into a public lesson about the consequences of challenging imperial authority. Every detail has been choreographed to maximize both spectacle and terror, the elevated platforms, ensuring perfect visibility, the religious imagery lending divine sanction to state violence, the presence of thousands of witnesses, transforming individual execution into collective intimidation. You scan the crowd and see faces you recognize from your rebellion, campesinos who had left their fields to follow your call for indigenous liberation, young men who had never known freedom but had dreamed it might be possible. Their expressions reveal the calculated cruelty of forcing your supporters to watch your destruction, requiring them to witness the price of resistance while being powerless to intervene. Near the front of the crowd, you spot Captain Ventura Landaeta, the Spanish cavalry officer whose forces had finally cornered your rebels at Checacup. He watches with the satisfied expression of a man who has completed a difficult but necessary task, his uniform pristine and his conscience apparently untroubled by the mass murder he helped orchestrate. But it is the presence of other Spanish officials that reveals the true nature of what is happening here. Men who had known you during your years as a colonial administrator, who had shared meals in your home and complimented your wife's hospitality, now sit in positions of honor to observe your family's slaughter. Their betrayal cuts deeper than enemy violence. These are men who had pretended friendship while calculating your eventual destruction. The executioner approaches your family with instruments that gleam like silver in the morning sunday. He moves with the unhurried competence of a craftsman who takes pride in his work, checking each rope and chain with careful attention to detail. This is no crude frontier violence, but sophisticated imperial machinery designed to transform human suffering into political messaging. Michaela stands on the scaffold with the same dignity she had shown while commanding troops in battle, her eyes searching the crowd until they find yours. In that moment of connection across the plaza, you see not defeat, but something far more dangerous to Spanish authority: the unbroken spirit of indigenous resistance. Her courage in the face of torture and death exposes the lie upon which colonial rule depends: the supposed weakness and dependence of native peoples. The executioner's assistant tears open her shirt, exposing her back to thousands of watching eyes. This calculated humiliation extends far beyond personal cruelty. It represents the symbolic violation of indigenous womanhood, the reduction of native dignity to Spanish entertainment. But even as they strip away her clothes, they cannot touch the fierce pride that burns in her eyes. The whip rises against the morning sky, its leather strips cutting through mountain air that carries the scent of snow from distant peaks where your ancestors once ruled as children of the Sunday. The whip's first strike against Michaela's back sounds like thunder rolling through the Andes, and in that moment, you understand that some sounds can shatter a man's soul more completely than any blade. Your wife's scream pierces the morning air, raw and primal, the cry of a woman who has commanded armies and never once begged for mercy, now forced to endure Spanish brutality, while thousands watch in enforced silence. 39 lashes, the number, carries biblical significance that Spanish officials relish, as if divine law sanctioned their cruelty. Each stroke draws blood that runs down Michaela's back in crimson streams, staining the wooden platform where your children will soon stand. The executioner works with mechanical precision, pausing between strikes to allow maximum pain while ensuring she remains conscious for the full ordeal. You strain against the ropes binding your arms until hemp cuts into your wrists, drawing blood that feels insignificant compared to your wife's suffering. The physical pain means nothing beside the agony of forced helplessness, the unbearable torture of watching while being unable to act. This paralysis, this reduction of a husband and father to mere witness, represents perhaps the cruelest aspect of Spanish justice. "Viva el Rey!" shouts a voice from the Spanish section of the crowd, after the 20th lash opens a particularly deep wound across Michaela's shoulders. The cry of loyalty to a distant monarch who will never know your wife's name feels like blasphemy in the face of such suffering. Other colonial voices take up the chant, transforming your family's execution into a celebration of imperial power. But something unexpected begins to ripple through the indigenous section of the crowd. At first, you think your ears deceive you. Surely no one would dare challenge Spanish authority at this moment of ultimate dominance. Then, you hear it clearly, a low humming that starts with a few brave voices and gradually spreads through hundreds of throats. The melody is ancient, older than Spanish conquest, a death song your ancestors sang for fallen warriors. The Spanish officials notice the humming and shift uncomfortably in their elevated seats. This was not part of their carefully choreographed display of power. Soldiers raise their rifles, scanning the crowd for leaders to arrest, but the song has no visible source. It seems to emerge from the very stones of Cusco itself. Michaela hears the ancestral melody and lifts her head, blood streaming down her face from a scalp wound where the whip's tip caught her during a particularly vicious strike. Her eyes find yours across the plaza, and impossibly, she smiles. Not the broken grimace of a defeated woman, but the fierce joy of someone who recognizes that even in death, the spirit of resistance cannot be killed. After the 39th lash tears flesh from her spine, they drag her broken body to the garrote vil, the iron collar that will crush her windpipe with slow, methodical pressure. The device gleams in the morning sun like jewelry, its polished metal surface reflecting the faces of Spanish officials who lean forward in their seats, unwilling to miss any detail of indigenous suffering. The executioner positions the collar around Michaela's neck with the careful attention of a craftsman fitting a custom-made tool. The iron feels cold against her throat, and you see her shiver not from fear, but from the metal's touch against skin that still holds the warmth of life. She does not plead or beg. Even facing death, she maintains the dignity that made her a natural leader among your people. Any final words? Ariche calls from his platform, the question carrying theatrical flourish rather than genuine interest in your wife's thoughts. This offer of last words represents another calculated cruelty, the illusion of mercy that highlights Spanish magnanimity while serving their propaganda needs. Michaela looks directly at the visitador, her voice carrying clearly across the plaza, despite the blood frothing at her lips. Supe kuna kanku. Runa kunaka manan chinka kunchu. The Spanish officials do not understand Quechua, but every indigenous person in the crowd catches her meaning. They are demons. The people will not disappear. Arechi's face reddens at being addressed in the native tongue he has spent his career trying to eliminate. He signals impatiently to the executioner, unwilling to allow Michaela another moment to demonstrate the unbroken spirit that makes her so dangerous to colonial authority. The iron screw turns with a grinding sound that carries across the silent plaza. Michaela's eyes bulge as the collar tightens, cutting off air and crushing the delicate bones of her throat. Her body convulses, fighting against the inevitable with the same fierce determination she had shown in battle. Her fingernails claw uselessly at the smooth metal, leaving bloody streaks on iron that has crushed countless throats before hers. You try to speak, to offer some final word of love or comfort, but the guards strike you silent with rifle butts that taste of metal and Spanish leather. This enforced muteness represents another layer of Spanish cruelty, forcing you to watch your wife die without the comfort of hearing your voice one last time. The grinding continues for what feels like hours, but probably lasts only minutes. Michaela's struggles gradually weaken as her brain starves for oxygen, her proud spirit finally forced to submit to the limitations of human flesh. When her body goes limp, the executioner continues turning the screw for several more rotations, ensuring death while demonstrating the thoroughness of Spanish justice. The plaza falls into absolute silence, except for the distant sound of condors crying in the mountains. The great birds that carry souls to their final rest, according to ancient beliefs, your Christian education never quite erased. Even the Spanish officials seem momentarily subdued by what they have witnessed, perhaps recognizing that they have killed something more significant than a single woman. Young Fernando breaks the silence with a cry that cuts through your chest like a blade. Mama, mama. He calls to his mother in Quechua, the musical language that Spanish priests have tried for centuries to destroy. His voice carries the universal grief of childhood, confronting incomprehensible loss, heartbreaking in any tongue. The guards laugh at his confusion, and their laughter reveals the true face of colonial rule, not civilized governance bringing order to primitive lands, but casual cruelty toward indigenous humanity. These men find entertainment in a child's grief, amusement in the destruction of native families. Fernando does not understand why his mother no longer responds to his calls. At 10 years old, death remains an abstract concept, something that happens to other people in distant places. He reaches toward Michaela's lifeless form, with small hands that will never again feel her touch, never receive her comfort during nightmares, or her praise for small accomplishments. The executioner's assistant approaches your youngest son with a length of rope, its coils gleaming like a serpent in the mountain sunday. Even hardened Spanish soldiers shift uncomfortably as they prepare to murder a child, their training in imperial violence apparently having limits when confronted with such obvious innocence. But colonial law is clear: your bloodline must be severed completely. No male heir can survive to inspire future revolts or claim ancestral authority over indigenous peoples. Fernando represents not just your son, but the possibility of continuing resistance, the chance that your revolution might resurrect itself in future generations. The rope goes around his small neck like a necklace made of hemp and death. Your son Fernando's feet leave the wooden platform, and time fractures into fragments that your mind cannot properly arrange: the sound of hemp tightening, the collective gasp from thousands of throats, the way morning light catches the tears streaming down your face like silver rivers, carrying away everything you once believed about justice and mercy and the possibility that human beings might choose compassion over cruelty. The boy's small body twists in the mountain air, legs kicking against nothing, hands clawing at the rope that steals his breath with methodical efficiency. He is too young to understand political rebellion or colonial oppression, too innocent to comprehend why adults would choose to murder children in the name of imperial stability. His crime was being born your son, carrying blood that Spanish authority has deemed dangerous to their continued dominance. You watch your youngest child die while bound helplessly to wooden posts, forced into the role of witness rather than protector. This inversion of natural order, a father unable to defend his son, represents the deepest violation Spanish justice can inflict. They are not merely executing your family, they are destroying the fundamental relationships that define human meaning. The crowd's reaction splits along the racial lines that define colonial society. Spanish settlers and officials watch with satisfaction or professional interest, viewing Fernando's death as necessary maintenance of political order. Indigenous spectators weep openly, their grief both personal and collective. They witness not just the murder of a child, but the symbolic assassination of their future. An elderly woman in the indigenous section begins wailing in Quechua, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of ancient mourning songs. Other native voices join her lament, creating a sound that predates Spanish conquest by centuries. This spontaneous funeral music transforms your son's execution into something larger than colonial theatre. It becomes a sacred ritual that honors indigenous life, while defying Spanish attempts to reduce native death to mere political messaging. Areche signals his soldiers to silence the mourners, but the keening spreads faster than military discipline can contain it. Rifle butts strike down the loudest voices, but others immediately rise to replace them. The Spanish discover that grief, unlike rebellion, cannot be suppressed through violence. It multiplies under pressure, creating echoes that reverberate far beyond their ability to control. When Fernando's struggles finally cease, his small form hangs motionless in the Andean morning, swaying gently in wind that carries the scent of snow from peaks where your ancestors once ruled as children of the Sunday. The sight burns itself into your memory with the permanence of scars, an image that will haunt whatever brief time remains to you. Your eldest son, Hipólito, watches his younger brother's corpse with eyes that have aged decades in the past few minutes. At 22, he had commanded rebel forces with tactical brilliance that impressed even Spanish military observers, proving himself as capable a leader as any European-trained officer. Now, facing his own execution, he embodies the colonial nightmare of educated indigenous leadership natives who could match European intelligence while maintaining cultural authenticity. The executioner approaches Hipólito with the same rope that killed his brother, hemp still warm from Fernando's final struggles. Your eldest son does not flinch or plead. He has inherited Michaela's dignity along with your strategic mind, facing death with the quiet courage that made him a natural commander during your rebellion. Do you renounce your father's heresy? Areche calls from his elevated platform, offering a final chance for public submission that would serve Spanish propaganda needs. The question represents another calculated cruelty, the illusion of choice that highlights imperial mercy while requiring betrayal of family and cause. Hipólito looks directly at the visitador, his voice carrying clearly across the plaza, "I am proud to be Túpac Amaru's son." The simple declaration hits Spanish officials like a physical blow, demonstrating that even facing death, indigenous pride cannot be broken through terror alone. Areche's face contorts with rage at this public defiance. He had expected your children to beg for mercy or denounce your rebellion, providing the Spanish with propaganda about native submission and the futility of resistance. Instead, Hipólito's courage exposes the hollow nature of colonial authority, revealing that true legitimacy cannot be imposed through violence alone. The rope tightens around your eldest son's throat with the same methodical precision that killed his brother. But Hipólito's execution carries different weight. He dies as a military commander, a proven leader whose tactical skills had prolonged your rebellion far beyond Spanish expectations. His death represents not just personal tragedy, but the elimination of indigenous military capability. As your son's life ebbs away in rhythmic spasms, you notice movement in the crowd that Spanish officials have not detected. Indigenous spectators are passing small objects from hand to hand, pieces of cloth torn from their garments, locks of hair cut with hidden knives, drops of blood drawn by fingernails pressed into palms. These fragments will become relics of this moment, physical reminders that will preserve the memory of your family's sacrifice long after Spanish authorities believe the lesson has been forgotten. Near the execution platform, you spot a young mestizo boy, perhaps 12 years old, caught between Spanish and indigenous worlds by the mixed blood flowing in his veins. His European father stands among the colonial officials, nodding approvingly at each death, while his indigenous mother weeps silently in the native section of the crowd. The child's face reflects the internal war between these competing loyalties, his features torn between inherited hatred and instinctive sympathy. This boy represents the future of colonial society, a generation that will grow up having witnessed the price of resistance, but also the dignity with which indigenous leaders can face death. Whether he becomes another Spanish collaborator or a future rebel may depend on which memory proves stronger, his father's approval of imperial violence or his mother's tears for murdered children. When Hipólito's body hangs lifeless beside his brother's, the executioner turns toward you with eyes as cold as Andean snow. The moment you have been dreading and anticipating arrives with the weight of inevitability, your turn to face the instruments of Spanish justice, to discover whether your own courage can match that displayed by your wife and sons. They drag you to the center of the platform, your feet stumbling over wooden planks slick with your family's blood. The scaffold has been transformed into an altar of sacrifice, a sacred space where colonial authority performs its most essential ritual, the destruction of indigenous leadership through spectacular violence. Spanish officials lean forward in their elevated seats, anticipating the main event. Your death represents more than revenge for military rebellion. It symbolizes the elimination of indigenous claims to political authority, the final severing of connections between native peoples and their pre-conquest heritage. You are not merely José Gabriel Condorcanqui, the failed rebel you are Túpac Amaru, the living link to ancestral power that Spanish rule cannot tolerate. They strip away your clothes with ceremonial deliberation, each removed garment representing another layer of identity being peeled away. The rough indigenous shirt symbol of your return to native roots after years of European dress. The woolen cloak marker of curaca status that Spanish law had recognized until your rebellion made such recognition inconvenient. Finally, the small silver pendant your mother had given you as a child, the last physical connection to family love, untainted by political consequence. Your naked body reflects the years of struggle that brought you to this moment. Scars from colonial service mark your hands' wounds, earned while collecting tribute from your own people, before you understood that working within their system meant becoming complicit in your people's destruction. More recent injuries tell the story of your rebellion: sword cuts from the battle at Sangarara, bullet wounds from the siege of Cusco, rope burns from your final capture in the mountains above Tinta. The 4 horses wait at the corners of the platform, their handlers checking leather straps and iron chains with professional attention to detail. This method of execution quartering by horses was specifically chosen for its theatrical horror, designed to terrorize indigenous populations across the viceroyalty, while demonstrating Spanish control over the most fundamental aspects of human existence. As they bind your limbs to the waiting animals, you feel hemp and leather cutting into flesh that will soon be torn apart by forces beyond human resistance. The restraints carry symbolic weight beyond their practical purpose. They represent the binding of indigenous potential, the harnessing of native power to serve colonial ends, even in death. Your arms and legs stretch toward the 4 cardinal directions, positioning your body to mirror the Andean conception of sacred space. Whether the Spanish understand this symbolism matters little. Your physical arrangement transforms their instrument of torture into something that resonates with deeper indigenous meaning, creating a final moment of spiritual resistance, even within imperial control. The horses strain against their traces, testing the strength of chains and the resilience of human flesh. The horses refuse to obey their handlers, and in that moment of unexpected defiance, you glimpse something the Spanish had not calculated into their theatre of death. Even animals can sense the wrongness of what they are being asked to perform. The lead stallion rears back on its haunches, eyes rolling white with terror or perhaps recognition that the man stretched between these chains carries something sacred that should not be destroyed. 30 minutes pass, while Spanish officials grow increasingly frantic, their carefully orchestrated display of imperial power dissolving into farce before thousands of witnesses. Whips crack against horseflesh, handlers shout commands in voices that crack with desperation, but the animals maintain their stubborn resistance to participating in your dismemberment. The crowd begins to murmur, indigenous voices interpreting this failure as divine intervention. Spanish settlers shifting uncomfortably as their certainty in colonial superiority wavers. You feel the leather straps cutting deeper into your wrists and ankles as the horses strain half-heartedly against their traces, but your limbs remain stubbornly attached to your torso. Pain shoots through your shoulders and hips, where joints stretch beyond their natural limits, but it pales beside the strange hope blooming in your chest. Perhaps the old gods still watch over their children. Perhaps Inti, the sun god of your ancestors, extends protection over his chosen descendant, even in this moment of ultimate vulnerability. Arichi's face reddens with embarrassment and rage, as his perfect execution transforms into public humiliation. Colonial authority depends absolutely on the appearance of invincible power, the illusion that Spanish will cannot be thwarted by any force on earth. But here, before thousands of witnesses, his machinery of death fails to function, exposing the fundamental weakness that lurks beneath imperial pretension. "Bring more horses," he shouts to his subordinates, spittle flying from his lips as composure abandons him entirely. "Stronger animals. This Indio will not make fools of us." The word hits you like a physical blow even now, at the threshold of death. Indio, the reduction of everything you are to colonial convenience, the denial of your identity as Curaca, as Inca descendant, as human being worthy of dignity. You have been Túpac Amaru for barely 2 years, but the name carries the weight of centuries, connecting you to ancestral power that Spanish authority cannot acknowledge without undermining its own legitimacy. Fresh horses arrive 6 this time, massive draft animals bred for pulling heavy loads through mountain passes. Their handlers are different too, professional executioners brought from Lima who specialize in the technical challenges of quartering human bodies. These men approach their work with clinical detachment, checking angles, and calculating the precise force needed to tear limbs from their sockets. As they reposition the chains around your already bleeding extremities, you catch sight of familiar faces in the crowd that Spanish officials have not noticed. Pedro Vilcapaza, who had served as your secretary during the rebellion, stands among the indigenous spectators, with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Beside him, Maria Herrera, one of the few Spanish women who had supported your cause, watches with her hand pressed against her mouth in horror. These faces remind you that your struggle had briefly transcended the racial boundaries that define colonial society. For 8 months, your rebellion had united indigenous peoples, mestizos, and even some Spaniards under a shared vision of justice that challenged the fundamental assumptions of imperial rule. You had abolished slavery, mandated indigenous languages as official, redistributed land to the dispossessed, creating a brief glimpse of what Peru might become without Spanish domination. The professional executioners complete their preparations with efficient brutality. The new chains bite deeper into flesh, already raw from the previous attempts, iron links cold against skin that burns with rope burn and stretched sinews. These men understand the mechanics of dismemberment in ways that provincial officials do not. They know precisely how much force to apply, which angles will produce the cleanest separations, how to ensure maximum suffering while guaranteeing eventual death. The horses strain against their harnesses, and this time you feel your body responding to forces beyond human resistance. Your left shoulder dislocates with a sound like breaking wood, sending waves of agony through your chest and arm. The crowd gasps collectively as your limb stretches visibly, tendons and muscles reaching their breaking point under pressures that no human frame was designed to withstand. But even as your body begins to surrender to mechanical forces, your mind travels to places beyond Spanish reach. You think of the mountain village where you were born, of your mother teaching you to speak Quechua before you learned Spanish, of the first time you saw Cusco's ancient walls built by Inca hands that had never known European tools or European masters. Your right leg separates from your hip with a wet tearing sound that carries across the silent plaza like thunder. Blood pools beneath the scaffold, soaking into wooden planks that will carry the stain of this moment long after your bones have crumbled to dust. Spanish officials lean forward in their seats, finally witnessing the spectacle they had orchestrated with such careful attention to detail. The pain transcends anything your mind can process, white-hot agony that burns through every nerve until sensation itself becomes meaningless. Yet somewhere beneath the physical torment, you maintain awareness of the larger forces at work. This is not merely your death, but the attempted murder of indigenous memory itself, the Spanish effort to destroy the possibility that native peoples might ever again challenge colonial authority. Your left arm tears free at the shoulder, and with it goes the last of your physical resistance to imperial will. The limb hangs from its chain like a piece of meat, disconnected from the nervous system that once made it part of your living body. Yet, your torso continues to breathe, your heart continues to beat, your eyes continue to witness the completion of Spanish justice. Through the haze of pain and approaching death, you see something that Spanish officials have not anticipated. The indigenous section of the crowd has begun to chant in unison, not the death songs they had sung for your family, but something older and more dangerous. The words are in Quechua, the musical language your people spoke when they ruled these mountains as children of the Sunday. Túpac Amaru Kani, Manan Wanyu Sakchu. The phrase ripples through hundreds of throats, growing stronger as more voices join the chorus. You recognize the words they mean, I am Túpac Amaru. I will not die. But the Spanish officials, ignorant of indigenous languages despite centuries of colonial rule, hear only meaningless sounds that they lack the cultural knowledge to interpret. This linguistic blindness represents one of the fundamental weaknesses of imperial authority, the inability to truly understand the peoples they claim to rule. Spanish power depends on surface control, the manipulation of visible symbols and public behaviors. But the deeper currents of indigenous resistance flow through channels that colonial administration cannot detect or influence. Your right arm separates with a sound like ripping fabric, leaving your torso connected to life by will alone. Medical science cannot explain how consciousness persists through such trauma, but contemporary witnesses, both Spanish and indigenous, record that your eyes remained alert, your lips continued to move. Even your voice-attempted speech long after physical dismemberment should have brought death. Ariche signals the executioner to complete the process with manual tools, unwilling to allow your stubborn survival to further embarrass Spanish authority. The man approaches with a knife, whose blade gleams like captured sunlight, its edge honed to surgical sharpness for the final act of imperial theatre. As steel slides between your ribs, seeking the heart that has pumped indigenous blood through 5 decades of life under colonial rule, you feel something unexpected, not despair, but a strange sense of completion. Your death will not end the story you began, but transform it into something more powerful than any living man could achieve. The blade finds its target, and darkness begins to claim the edges of your vision. But in that gathering shadow, you see faces that Spanish eyes cannot detect: the spirits of your ancestors, the ghosts of the first Túpac Amaru, and all the indigenous leaders who died rather than submit to foreign domination. They welcome you into a brotherhood of resistance that transcends the limitations of mortal flesh. Your final breath carries the scent of mountain snow and native flowers, the perfume of a land that will outlive every empire that claims to own it. Your dismembered body becomes a map of Spanish terror drawn across the Andean landscape, each severed piece sent to a different province where your rebellion had taken root like seeds in fertile soil. They believe this dispersal will prevent any single location from becoming a shrine to your memory, not understanding that indigenous spirituality sees the sacred flowing through the entire territory of ancestral land rather than concentrated in particular places. Your head travels to Tinta, the mountain town where your revolution began with legal petitions and reasonable requests for reform before Spanish intransigence forced you to take up arms. The colonial officials who ordered this grotesque display intend it as a final lesson about the futility of challenging imperial power. But the indigenous people who gather to witness your arrival do not see defeat. They see the face of a man who chose death over submission, whose sacrifice proves that Spanish authority, however brutal, cannot ultimately destroy the human spirit. The pole that holds your head sways in the mountain wind, but your eyes, still open despite death, seem to watch over the community you tried to liberate. Children who were too young to remember your living presence will grow up knowing that once someone who looked like them had dared to dream of freedom. That knowledge, planted in young minds, will prove more dangerous to Spanish rule than any army you commanded while alive. Your arms journey to Tungasuka and Carabaya, the mining districts where your rebellion had found its strongest support among indigenous workers, condemned to early death in silver shafts that enriched Spanish nobles who had never seen the Andes. The gruesome displays are meant to crush the spirit of resistance, but miners who gather around the poles speak in whispers of the man who had tried to end their suffering, who had declared that native people deserved better than slow death in colonial mines. In Tungasuka, an old woman brings flowers each morning, simple mountain blooms that grow wild in places Spanish eyes never see. She leaves them at the base of the pole and speaks to your severed arm in Quechua, telling you about her grandson who died in the mines last winter, about the dream of justice you had given her people before Spanish forces crushed your rebellion. Her daily ritual transforms a symbol of imperial terror into something approaching sacred remembrance. Your legs are displayed in Livitaka and Chukinga, communities that had provided soldiers for your army and supplies for your cause. The Spanish intend these exhibits to demonstrate the price of supporting indigenous resistance, but local people who come to stare at your remains remember not your death, but your life. The months when you had ruled as legitimate Curaca, when justice had seemed possible, when indigenous voices had carried weight in colonial courts. A young mestizo boy in Chukinga, caught between Spanish and indigenous worlds by the mixed blood flowing in his veins, stares at your leg with an expression that troubles the Spanish soldiers guarding the display. His European father had fought against your rebellion, but his indigenous mother weeps silently as she recognizes the limb of a man who had tried to end the racial hierarchy that makes her son's very existence a source of confusion and pain. This boy represents the future that Spanish officials fear most, a generation that will grow up having witnessed both the dignity of indigenous resistance and the brutality of imperial response. Whether he becomes another Spanish collaborator or a future rebel may depend on which memory proves stronger in his developing consciousness. But the most significant display occurs in Cusco itself, where your torso, the core that housed your revolutionary heart, is burned in the main plaza, while Spanish officials, force indigenous spectators to watch. The flames are meant to symbolize the complete destruction of your physical presence, the final erasure of the man who dared call himself Túpac Amaru and claim ancestral authority over these mountains. As smoke rises from your burning flesh, carrying the scent of your sacrifice into the Andean sky, something happens that Spanish planners had not anticipated. The wind shifts, blowing the smoke directly toward the cathedral, where Spanish priests conduct masses in Latin for congregations that pray in Quechua. Indigenous witnesses interpret this as a sign that your spirit refuses to be contained by colonial boundaries, that even death cannot limit the influence of authentic leadership. The ashes are scattered from mountaintops to prevent any physical remains from inspiring future revolts, but Spanish officials have misunderstood the nature of inspiration. Ideas cannot be destroyed by fire any more than justice can be killed by execution. Your example lives not in fragments of bone and flesh, but in the consciousness of everyone who witnessed your courage, everyone who heard your voice, everyone who glimpsed the possibility that native peoples might govern themselves rather than submit to foreign rule. In the weeks following your execution, colonial administrators compile reports for their superiors in Lima and Madrid, documenting the successful suppression of indigenous rebellion and the restoration of proper order throughout the viceroyalty. These official documents describe your death as the logical conclusion of a criminal enterprise, justice delivered upon a disturber of Spanish peace and prosperity. But other kinds of records tell different stories. Parish registers begin recording an unusual number of children named José Gabriel and Micaela parents throughout the Andes, choosing to honor your memory by passing your names to future generations. Spanish priests, confused by this sudden popularity of particular saints' names, fail to recognize the political significance of indigenous families claiming connection to your martyred bloodline. Indigenous communities that had remained neutral during your rebellion now begin organizing resistance networks, inspired not by your military success, but by your example of principled defiance. The Spanish discover that martyrdom can prove more powerful than victory, that your death has created exactly what they sought to prevent, a unifying symbol of indigenous resistance that transcends tribal and regional differences. 3 months after your execution, reports reach colonial administrators of a new rebel leader in the mountains of Bolivia who claims to be your younger brother. Spanish investigators quickly determine that this man has no actual family connection to you, but his ability to rally indigenous support by invoking your name demonstrates the transformation your death has achieved in native consciousness. Your wife Micaela becomes a legend in her own right, remembered as the woman who commanded armies and died unbroken. Indigenous women throughout the viceroyalty begin naming their daughters after her, ensuring that her memory survives in the most personal sphere of resistance, the family names that connect each generation to its revolutionary heritage. The stories of your son's murders spread through indigenous communities like wildfire, creating a narrative of Spanish cruelty that even sympathetic colonial observers find difficult to defend. The image of 10-year-old Fernando, hanging from a rope, haunts administrative correspondence for years afterward, a reminder that imperial power ultimately depends on the willingness to commit atrocities that normal human conscience cannot accept. By the first anniversary of your execution, Spanish officials recognize that their spectacular display of imperial power has backfired spectacularly. Rather than terrorizing indigenous populations into permanent submission, your death has inspired the largest native uprising in colonial American history. Rebellion spreads from Peru into Bolivia, Ecuador, and Argentina, requiring massive military reinforcement from Europe to restore Spanish control. The broader revolution, sparked by your martyrdom, continues for 3 more years, forcing colonial authorities to spend enormous resources on military campaigns that nearly bankrupt the viceroyalty. Your death, intended to save Spanish rule, instead hastens its eventual collapse by demonstrating both the necessity and the possibility of indigenous resistance. But perhaps your truest victory lies in the transformation of consciousness your sacrifice achieved. Before your rebellion, native peoples throughout the Andes, identified primarily through local tribal affiliations, seeing themselves as Quechua or Aymara, or members of specific communities rather than part of a broader indigenous nation. After your execution, they begin to imagine themselves as united by shared oppression and common heritage, as peoples who might work together for liberation rather than competing for Spanish favor. The name you chose, Túpac Amaru, meaning royal serpent, proves prophetic in ways Spanish officials never understood. Like the great serpent of Andean mythology that sheds its skin to achieve new life, your death becomes the means through which indigenous resistance transforms itself into something more powerful and enduring than any single rebellion could achieve. Today, nearly 2.5 centuries after your execution in Cusco's main plaza, your name echoes through Latin American politics and indigenous rights movements worldwide. Revolutionary organizations invoke your memory, communities celebrate your legacy, and artists create works that honor your sacrifice and vision. The Spanish had hoped to use your dismembered body as a period ending the sentence of indigenous resistance. Instead, it became a comma in a much longer story, a pause before new paragraphs of rebellion that would eventually culminate in the independence movements of the early 19th century and continue through contemporary struggles for indigenous rights and social justice. Your execution was meant to demonstrate the futility of challenging imperial power, to prove that resistance leads only to destruction. Instead, it revealed that some truths are worth dying for, that authentic leadership survives even the most brutal attempts at elimination, and that the human spirit, once awakened to its own dignity, cannot be killed by any force on earth. The morning mist still clings to the cobblestones of Cusco's main plaza, but now it carries different dreams, visions of justice that outlive the empires that sought to crush them, whispers of dignity that echo across centuries of struggle, promises that someday, somehow, the children of the sun will reclaim their rightful place in the land their ancestors knew as paradise, before strangers came with crosses and swords to teach them about civilization.